In the quiet town of Social Circle, Georgia, the biggest thing on local officials' minds, well, it used to be the capacity of their old water and sewer lines. It's a small, tight-knit community, maybe 5,000 people, about an hour east of Atlanta. Life there moves at a pretty predictable pace. But lately there's been this strange tension. It really started when these internal federal documents began to circulate. And they reveal that the government doesn't just see Social Circle as a dot on a map. They see it as a logistics hub. Right. The plan itself. It's remarkably efficient, at least on paper. It treats the national deportation strategy like a high-speed retail operation. Think Amazon Prime, but for human beings. The idea is to take these huge, empty industrial warehouses, the kind built for shipping pallets and consumer goods, and, well, repurpose them. In Social Circle specifically, there's this one 183-acre mega distribution plant that's under the microscope. And the federal solicitation, it promises a facility that maximizes efficiency and promotes dignity. For the local economy, it kind of whispers this promise of hundreds of new jobs, federal investment. But then you look at the math, and that word efficiency starts to feel a little more haunting. That single warehouse in Social Circle, it's slated to hold up to 10,000 people. Instantly, a town of 5,000 residents would be forced to host a captive population that's double its own size. And all of them contained within a structure that was originally designed for, cardboard boxes. Local leaders were just blindsided. They point out that their current infrastructure can barely support the people who already live there, let alone a sudden influx of 10,000 detainees. And this pattern, it's repeating itself all across the country. From these little hamlets in Pennsylvania to the suburbs of Virginia, the government uses words like internment and staging, while critics are pointing to a really uncomfortable historical echo of World War II-era camps. The logic seems simple. It's cheaper and faster to warehouse people than it is to build prisons. But as these massive industrial shells are being outfitted with medical units and law libraries, the question for us is, what happens when we start treating a human rights crisis as a supply chain problem? That opening story about the shock in Social Circle, Georgia, it really just encapsulates this whole systemic structure that's being revealed nationwide. You have this massive federal-level strategy that completely overrides any local reality. The government is basically applying the language and the infrastructure of modern commerce logistics, throughput, efficiency to this incredibly high-stakes issue of mass human confinement. So that's our mission today in this deep dive, to move beyond those local headlines and really unpack the vast systemic implications of this federal plan. We need to figure out what are the legal, financial, and community implications of turning supply chain hubs into mass detention centers, and what does it all tell us about the nation's priorities?
It is a profound structural redesign. It's not just a policy tweak. And that language you mentioned, logistics, throughput, repurposing, that's exactly why we need to dig into this. This isn't just a matter of adding a few thousand beds,
No, it's much bigger.
It's an institutional shift. It's using commercial logic to justify what is fundamentally a massive expansion of state power over civilians. By framing enforcement as an issue of efficiency, the plan is really masking these profound shifts in due process, and it raises immediate, very uncomfortable historical parallels that we absolutely have to confront.
So where do we start? How do we break this down?
To really get our heads around the gravity of this plan and what it really means for civil liberties, I think we have to analyze it through three distinct but intertwined lenses. First, there's the critical legal distinction of civil detention and its inherent vulnerability when it comes to due process. Second, the colossal financial investment. I mean, we are talking billions of dollars and the private windfalls that are attached to managing this infrastructure. And third, the direct, immediate, and often negative impact on American communities that are suddenly being asked to host these massive megacenters.
All right, let's start with that first lens then. The sheer scale of this project, the overall scope of this plan laid out in these federal documents it's just startling. The government is essentially overhauling the system to hold a projected capacity of more than 80,000 people.
80,000.
In these newly converted industrial warehouses. I mean, that's an enormous number. It's larger than the population of a lot of American cities.
It is. And it's a system built explicitly for speed and volume. Internally, they refer to it as the feeder system model.
Feeders.
Yeah, think of it structurally like modern retail. Instead of trying to process every single package individually at 10,000 different post offices, you consolidate. Detainees are briefly processed locally, that's the initial spoke, before they're transferred quickly to these massive regional facilities, the hubs.
And these hubs are located strategically.
Oh, absolutely. They're near major logistics arteries, usually international airports or massive interstate transit routes, because the core function is rapid movement and deportation.
And these mega centers aren't small holding pens. They're slated to hold between, 5,000 and 10,000 people each.
That's right. In states like Texas, Arizona, Louisiana, Georgia, Virginia, Missouri, you're seeing this pattern emerge.
I think the thing I found most shocking was the population concentration in some of these places. When you look at the documents detailing the plans for Stafford, Virginia, the proposal calls for a facility that could hold up to 10,000 detainees. For context, the official population of the town of Stafford is only about 5,370 people. So the captive population would literally more than double the town's residential base overnight.
And that scale is consistent right across the board. In Hutchins, Texas, they're planning for a capacity of 9,500 people. In Hammond, Louisiana, the plan is for 9,000. These numbers don't just, change the local population. They strain every single aspect of local infrastructure, from emergency services to traffic flow on a dramatic scale.
And it's not just the mega centers. The network is also fleshed out by smaller facilities too, right? We saw plans for about 16 smaller conversion sites across the country.
Yes, with capacities around 1,500 people. And they're planned everywhere from tiny Tremont, Pennsylvania to Roxbury, New Jersey. The system is designed to be geographically diffuse, but it's functionally centralized around these massive hubs.
Okay, so this creation of a massive regionalized infrastructure, these hubs and spokes, it feels like it forces us to look back, historically.
It does. It absolutely forces us to engage with a historical context because the U.S. has confined civilians en masse before. And the blueprints, they share some really disturbing features. We have to look at the internment of over 120,000 Japanese Americans during World War II.
That is such a critical comparison point.
Yeah.
And what's crucial to remember about that WWII-era internment is that it wasn't a criminal justice action. These were people confined without any criminal charges. And maybe most significantly, 2/3 of those 120,000 people were U.S. citizens, confined purely based on their heritage and their status.
Precisely. And if you strip away the specific historical context of wartime fear, the structural comparison between that and this current warehouse detention plan is, well, it's chillingly similar. Both rely on civil confinement, which is very distinct from criminal punishment. Both require absolutely no criminal charges for prolonged confinement. Both rely on group or status-based targeting, whether it's based on ancestry or immigration status. And critically, both systems rely on setting up remote facilities, often far from urban centers and legal resources, which inherently limits access to legal recourse and public scrutiny.
But I think the core question remains, why does the civil nature of this confinement matter so much today? I mean, if you're locked up, whether it's a criminal jail or administrative detention, it probably feels the same to the person inside. Why is that constitutional distinction so vital?
The civil nature is absolutely central to the legal dangers of scaling the system up to 80,000 people. You see, immigration detention is administrative. That means it's intended to ensure someone appears for court proceedings or for their eventual removal. It's supposed to be preventive, not punitive.
Okay, so not punishment.
Exactly. And because it's classified as civil, detainees have none of the robust protections that you get in criminal law. There's no right to a jury trial, no requirement for a criminal conviction, and absolutely no fixed sentence.
So your detention is justified purely by your status as a non-citizen who's subject to removal, rather than by a finding of guilt for a crime.
That's it, exactly. And this specific constitutional framework is why due process protections are inherently less robust and more easily curtailed. Historically, the Supreme Court has only ever considered civil detention to be constitutional if it remains limited in scope, reasonably related to a legitimate, non-punitive government purpose-like ensuring appearance and subject to ongoing review.
But when you scale that system up to 80,000 people...
When you scale it up to 80,000 people and you put them in converted remote warehouses, the argument that the detention is somehow limited or non-punitive, it becomes extremely tenuous. The sheer size and the speed are fundamentally what push this entire system past constitutional boundaries. And this leads us directly to the core systemic risk here. Scale is the trigger for constitutional failure. When you prioritize massive volume and speed, effective judicial oversight just collapses. We don't even need to wait for the new 80,000 person system to see this stress.
Right, we're already seeing the strain.
We are. ICE detention has already reached record highs, exceeding 68,000 people. And what's crucial here is the profile of who's being detained. Data consistently shows that the majority, nearly 2/3 of people currently detained, have no criminal convictions at all.
Now 2/3?
None. They are detained solely for civil immigration violations.
That statistic is so important. These facilities, which look and feel just like prisons, are overwhelmingly holding people who have committed no crime in the U.S. And this is where that macro plan connects right back to individual lives. It reveals the immediate, terrifying consequences of building a system this fast.
Think back to that Stafford, Virginia warehouse conversion we mentioned, the one slated for 10,000 detainees. This isn't a long-term facility. It's an enormous processing hub. And we heard the story of a woman named Elena. Her brother, a local laborer, he just disappeared into that hub 3 weeks ago. The panic in her attempts to find him is just heartbreaking. She called every legal aid office she could find, only to be told that because this is a warehouse detention site designed for rapid throughput, the typical legal rules, they just don't apply.
The most terrifying detail in that account is the legal invisibility. There's no judge scheduled to see them. There's no lawyer allowed through the gates. The system is designed to accelerate processing, which effectively means removing all the judicial checks and balances. The legal system, for someone like Elena's brother, it just ceases to exist the moment they walk through those warehouse doors.
That story precisely illustrates the risk of this shift from judicial oversight to pure administrative processing. And this enormous push for speed and volume is enabled by the expansion of tools like expedited removal or ER.
Okay, so expedited removal has been a tool the government has had since, 1996? But it's the recent application on this massive scale that really concerns critics. Can you clarify for us the fundamental practical difference between standard removal proceedings and ER?
The distinction really comes down to the judge. In a standard removal, a non-citizen is entitled to a formal hearing before an immigration judge. The government has to prove they're removable, and the individual has the fundamental right to present evidence, to call witnesses, to apply for relief, like asylum or cancellation of removal.
So it's a real legal process.
It is. It's time-consuming, but it offers these critical due process safeguards. Under expedited removal, all those safeguards are drastically curtailed or just eliminated. Instead of a neutral judge, you have immigration officers who are enforcement agents, not judicial arbiters, making the final deportation determination.
And this is after, a very brief interview.
Often, yes. A very brief interview conducted immediately upon apprehension. The result is that fairness is sacrificed entirely for speed.
This whole process puts an incredible burden of proof entirely on the individual, often while they are in custody and, in shock. They are required to prove, often right on the spot, that they've been continuously present in the U.S. for 2 years.
And they have to demonstrate this clearly and beyond doubt. I mean, just imagine needing to instantaneously produce an ironclad paper trail to satisfy an enforcement officer. Things like utility bills covering a 2-year period, school records, rental agreements, employment documents, tax records.
And you have to do this in a high-stress, potentially coercive environment, often without any access to your personal belongings or outside communication.
Exactly. And the lack of clear, consistent guidance on what documentation is actually sufficient. A utility bill from 3 years ago might be fine for one officer, but rejected by another. It leaves people extremely vulnerable to arbitrary or inconsistent treatment, especially when the institutional priority is just moving people through the system as quickly as humanly possible.
And this high-speed, high-stakes system, it inevitably creates errors. The risk of wrongful detention isn't just theoretical, is it? We're talking about documented cases of U.S. citizens getting swept up in this enforcement dragnet.
It is a profound known failing of the system. Major reporting by the Los Angeles Times and the ACLU has documented multiple instances of U.S. citizens being mistakenly detained by ICE. Usually it's due to database errors, name misidentification, or just bureaucratic mix-ups. When you introduce a system designed for rapid, large-scale processing in facilities focused on throughput, these converted warehouses, you multiply that risk exponentially.
So the structure is basically designed to be error-tolerant in favor of speed.
That's a good way to put it. Mistakes are inevitable, and the institutional infrastructure for correction, which would require slowing the system down and adding layers of review, is intentionally minimized.
And the psychological dimension of this system, especially when we talk about indefinite detention, it's just chilling. We're hearing reports from attorneys about detainees losing hope incredibly quickly. It seems like the system uses exhaustion and despair as a tool.
Well, recent policy shifts that restrict judges from granting bonds for many immigrants mean that tens of thousands of people face mandatory indefinite detention while their cases just crawl through the system. The uncertainty, the lack of a fixed release date, the horrific conditions in these massive cold warehouse settings, it creates a psychological environment that quickly becomes intolerable.
This isn't just about physical comfort.
No, not at all. It's about breaking the will to fight a legal case. I recall some observations made by mental health professionals and longtime immigration attorneys. They say individuals facing indefinite detention often lose the will to pursue even incredibly strong legal cases. They choose to self-deport after only 10 days to 2 weeks.
Just 10 days to 2 weeks.
Because the conditions are just so dark and desperate.
So the detention system isn't just about ensuring someone shows up to court. It becomes a deliberate tool for accelerating removals by psychologically coercing people into abandoning their legal rights.
Absolutely. And the design of the transfer system further cements this legal isolation. The hub and spoke model requires frequent transfers, maybe from a border patrol station to a local processing spoke, then a transfer to the Stafford or Hutchins Mega Center, and perhaps another transfer to an airport facility before removal.
And each transfer is a destructive event.
It is. It breaks the continuity of any necessary medical care. It profoundly disrupts attorney-client relationships, especially if the facility is remote and the person can no longer physically meet their legal counsel. And crucially, it diffuses institutional accountability. When people are constantly moved, it becomes nearly impossible to track who was responsible for medical neglect or abuse at any single facility. This constant movement creates what we call the data blind spot, where the full extent of the harm, the medical neglect, the forced removals, the broken legal cases, is only visible years later when investigative reports finally reconstruct the damage.
When we talk about redesigning an entire federal enforcement system this fundamentally, we have to talk about the cost. And it is monumental. Congress has approved a staggering $45 billion to fund this mass detention and deportation plan. What's most striking to me is the heavy, near-total reliance on private contractors to execute it.
That $45 billion figure is the engine driving this entire expansion. It explains exactly why the private detention industry isn't merely participating, but enthusiastically accelerating this plan. Companies like CoreCivic and GEO Group, which collectively handle roughly 90% of all immigration detention in the country.
90%.
They've already secured new or expanded contracts specifically related to this capacity expansion.
And their internal communications, they reflect this surge of optimism. GEO Group, for example, publicly stated that they are built for this unique moment, anticipating robust growth. Meanwhile, CoreCivic executives have talked about anticipating continued robust contracting activity throughout 2025.
And their stock prices have mirrored that outlook. They've risen substantially since the federal planning for this large-scale expansion really took concrete shape. The profit motive fundamentally shifts the incentive structure, moving it entirely away from oversight or care. We can see this vividly by looking at the specifics of the warehouse conversion process. Take the example from Hutchins, Texas, where a massive private security firm retrofitted a cold storage facility. The focus on retrofitting these shells, installing thousands of industrial cots in spaces previously used for shipping containers, is entirely driven by the per diem profit model.
Can you break down the mechanics of that per diem model for us? What does that actually mean?
In essence, the private contractor is paid a flat, fixed rate for every single person detained, every single day. So if the government pays, say, $150 per day per person, and the contractor can reduce the actual cost of housing, feeding, and securing that person to $100 a day, the remaining $50 is pure profit.
So human beings in this system are treated literally like inventory on a ledger.
That's right. A former employee from one of these private firms claimed that the push from corporate leadership was always for the minimal services that could possibly be provided while remaining technically compliant with their contract. Because maximizing profit relies entirely on minimizing those daily operational costs to meet quarterly earnings targets.
It's a vicious cycle where the financial incentive is directly opposed to the well-being of the detainee. But the deeper question is, why is the government allowing such a fiscally inefficient system to expand? The numbers just don't seem to add up.
They don't. The financial case against mass detention is overwhelming, and that's based on ICE's own benchmarks. Detaining one person in a facility, whether it's private or public, costs approximately $150 to $160 per day. This covers facility staff, utilities, food, security. everything.
Okay. Now, if we compare that to what they call alternatives to detention programs, TD things like electronic monitoring, ankle bracelets, or community case management, the cost just plummets.
Those ATD programs cost under $5 per person per day. The disparity is astounding.
Under $5 versus $160. So when you apply that math to the scale of this plan, that 80,000 capacity target, the costs become astronomical. Even if we estimate for a stable population of, say, 50,000 detainees, detaining them in physical warehouses costs the taxpayer approximately $2.8 billion a year.
$2.8 billion. And supervising that exact same population through ATD programs costs under $80 million per year.
That is a difference of over $2.7 billion annually for a population that, as we established, is overwhelmingly non-criminal.
So on purely economic grounds, the choice to pursue mass warehouse detention is one of the least efficient policy choices available. The decision to build and fund this infrastructure suggests that the policy driver isn't fiscal prudence. It's more likely political optics, the creation of immediate capacity for rapid removal, and the immense pressure exerted by the industry that benefits from that $45 billion investment.
Speaking of that immense pressure, we have to address the political dimension of this massive commitment, which critics often call a pay-a-play dynamic. We know that the two largest private detention companies and their executives collectively donated nearly $2.8 million to political election efforts and inaugural funds.
The timing is highly suggestive. This proximity between massive, lucrative federal contract awards and substantial political donations, it raises severe concerns about the process of selecting contractors and determining capacity needs. The money trail suggests that the industry anticipated and actively supported the creation of the policy environment necessary for this type of record-breaking expansion.
They were essentially investing in the infrastructure they knew the government was planning to fund.
That's one way to look at it. And the cost-cutting measures inherent in this for-profit model, they directly impact the quality of life inside the facilities, right down to the staff training and safety.
How so?
Well, private facilities prioritize profitability, which leads to systemic cost-cutting that compromises basic safety and essential services. This isn't just speculation. The data backs this up consistently. Studies comparing private prisons to federally run institutions, specifically the Bureau of Prisons, or BOP, show that private facilities have significantly higher rates of inmate and inmate-on-staff assaults.
Higher rates of violence.
Yes. The pressure to save money means fewer guards per person, less experienced staff, and inadequate control over violent incidents.
And how does that profit motive affect the hiring and retention of staff inside these converted warehouses?
Private facilities often rely on non-unionized, lesser-trained employees who work on a high turnover basis. And this employment structure feeds directly back into that per diem model. Staff are essentially incentivized to maximize the population and minimize their interactions or resource expenditures per individual. This environment can rationalize abusive behavior and leads to severe documented failures, including chronic failures to provide adequate medical care and mental health services because costs are prioritized above all else. When you house 10,000 people in a warehouse, the logistical incentive is to treat them as bulk commodities, not as individuals with medical needs.
Let's shift our focus to the physical reality of these facilities and their impact on the surrounding communities. We're talking about repurposing massive industrial shells. Warehouses are designed for packages and merchandise, for high volume and low complexity. They are not designed for human habitation, let alone for the long-term detention of thousands of people.
The physical transformation required is enormous, and it really highlights the inherent absurdity of this plan. Commercial real estate experts who reviewed the federal proposals raised serious questions about the feasibility of these rapid conversions. I mean, think about the infrastructure needed for 10,000 people.
Right.
You need immense modifications for plumbing, sanitation. You're talking about 10,000 toilets, flushing multiple times a day complex, HVAC and climate control systems, and creating adequate separation and secure space within structures originally designed to store pallets. The corners that are cut during this rapid retrofitting process are where the health and safety risks multiply.
And the sudden imposition of these megacenters on local communities. It often happens with zero local input. We saw that example of Roxbury, New Jersey, a suburban township where local officials were completely blindsided. They learned about the plans for a 1,500-person capacity warehouse conversion through media reports, not through any formal communication from DHS or ICE.
This lack of consultation is a major point of conflict. And furthermore, many of the proposed warehouse sites, especially those chosen for logistical reasons, not for existing community support, they simply do not have the adequate public water or sewer infrastructure necessary to support such a massive influx of detainees. Imposing a 1,500-person capacity facility on a small township's utility system poses a huge, unbudgeted logistical and financial burden on the municipality. It forces local taxpayers to subsidize a federal detention system.
Another critical element of the community impact is the geographical targeting. This expansion seems to be disproportionately targeting minority-majority cities. Hammond, Louisiana, a proposed site, is 45% African American. Hutchins, Texas, is 46% Hispanic. This has to raise profound fears about the transformation of the local environment.
It absolutely does. We saw powerful videos from town hall meetings in places like Hammond where local residents, teachers, business owners, they stood up to express a collective fear. The consensus among activists and community leaders is that the presence of such a massive federal detention hub leads to fears of increased racial profiling and sweeps.
So it changes the whole feeling of a town.
Completely. Local law enforcement often works in conjunction with federal agencies, which means legal residents, especially people of color, become afraid to simply go to the grocery store, pick up their children from school, or commute to work. The social fabric of the city transforms into what critics call a carceral landscape.
This brings us to the really profound policy trade-off that we're making as a nation. This massive $45 billion investment in incarceration and detention infrastructure, it pulls resources directly away from chronic, existing community needs for U.S. citizens.
This trade-off is measurable, and the numbers are startling. We see it documented clearly in state budgets all across the country. Look at California, for example, which often sets national trends. The annual cost to house one inmate, $62,000, profoundly dwarfs the state spending per K-12 student, which is only around $9,200.
Wow, that's 6 times more.
It's a fundamental statement of priority. We are willing to invest 6 times more in incarceration than in education. This decision perpetuates cycles of poverty and feeds the school-to-prison pipeline by slashing funds for education, mental health services, and crucial social programs that could otherwise stabilize communities.
That is the core question that defines our national priorities. What exactly are the billions allocated to mass detention not funding? When you look at the deficit in essential services for U.S. citizens and communities, the choice becomes even more stark. Let's just itemize some of the most urgent gaps that these funds could be addressing. Let's start with healthcare.
The state of healthcare access in the U.S. is a crisis, especially in underserved areas. The Health Resources and Services Administration reports that over 100 million Americans live in designated health professional shortage areas. That means they lack adequate access to primary care, dental, or mental health providers.
100 million people.
Yes. That $2.7 billion saved annually by switching to ATD programs could profoundly fund community health centers, open new clinics in rural and urban deserts, and dramatically increase mental health capacity nationwide.
And then there's the issue of education infrastructure. The U.S. Department of Education consistently documents these large funding disparities between wealthy and poor districts, aging infrastructure that compromises learning environments, and persistent teacher shortages in public schools across the country.
Investing in modernizing those schools, addressing the teacher shortage crisis by offering better pay or providing adequate resources for special education and early childhood intervention would directly address the systemic disadvantages that often fuel the cycle of poverty and ultimately lead to higher incarceration rates later. It's a direct investment in the nation's future stability rather than simply investing in the infrastructure of confinement.
We also face a massive behavioral health crisis in this country, a severe shortage of mental health and addiction treatment resources.
SAMHS reports severe shortages of behavioral health providers despite rising crisis levels, including rising suicide rates and overdose deaths linked to the opioid epidemic. Millions of Americans with serious mental illness or substance use disorders go untreated due to cost or the sheer lack of providers in their area. Imagine dedicating just a fraction of that $2.7 billion annual difference to immediately increasing the availability of behavioral health providers in communities that currently have none.
And housing affordability, it remains a national crisis, directly impacting economic stability for millions.
Housing and Urban Development, HUD, documents a severe shortage of affordable rental units and rising homelessness across many regions, affecting veterans, the elderly, working families. Redirecting funds from inefficient detention models to housing subsidies or the construction of affordable rental units could stabilize millions of U.S. households immediately. When people have stable housing, every other social measure, from health to employment, improves dramatically.
We also face huge deficits in just basic physical infrastructure. The American Society of Civil Engineers consistently grades U.S. infrastructure, from roads and bridges to public water systems, as poor to mediocre. This is the very same infrastructure that a place like Roxbury, New Jersey is struggling to maintain even before they have to support a new federal detention center.
And while many of these needs affect U.S. citizens directly, we also have to consider the efficiency within the system itself. Most critically, this massive enforcement and detention budget is not being used to stabilize the legal immigration system. USCIS currently faces a staggering net backlog nearing 5 million cases.
5 million cases just waiting. That includes family reunification petitions, naturalization processing for legal residents, work authorization applications. The whole system is basically frozen.
Exactly. Investing funds directly into USCIS to hire more adjudicators and clear these backlogs would speed up legal pathways, reduce the pressure on enforcement agencies, and stabilize millions of U.S. citizen families and workplaces. Instead of spending billions to detain people who could otherwise be legally processing their claims, we choose the path that slows down all legal immigration while accelerating civil detention.
So when we view the federal budget as a statement of national priority,
the decision to normalize detention spending at these historically high levels, which funds inefficiency and institutional neglect, represents a monumental choice that risks long-term public consequence by neglecting chronic, essential needs of the American population.
So we've completed our deep dive into the sources revealing this warehouse detention plan. We started by seeing how the language of modern logistics throughput, efficiency, speed, is being used to justify what is, in effect, a massive, status-based system of civil confinement that echoes some of the most troubling chapters in American history. We established that this new structure sacrifices due process for speed, leading to legal vacuums and the psychological coercion of detainees.
And our analysis of the financial underpinnings makes it clear this choice is not driven by fiscal logic. The massive investment, $45 billion, is disproportionately channeled into a private for-profit model that costs taxpayers over $2.7 billion more annually than community supervision alternatives. It fuels an industry that prioritizes maximizing population over human care or public safety. And the lesson history teaches us is profound. Capacity creates pressure to use capacity. When structures are built for mass civil detention, especially durable, industrial-scale infrastructure like these converted warehouses, they are rarely temporary. They become self-justifying infrastructure that future generations must reckon with, enabling systemic legal and ethical failures long after the initial emergency justification fades.
The data makes it clear that mass civil detention is among the least fiscally efficient tools available to the government, costing $150 or $160 per person per day compared to less than $5 for supervision programs. The massive financial commitment to build and sustain a system of this scale forces us to recognize that this expenditure comes directly at the cost of funding critical, established needs in American communities, including healthcare, education, housing, and stabilizing the legal immigration system itself. This financial choice delivers a short-term enforcement strategy but risks long-term public consequence for American communities. This is the infrastructure we are building, and this is the legacy we are accepting.